Well, Jason, thanks so much for being on the show. I want to start with this. You worked at ESPN for a number of years, rubbed shoulders with some of the biggest names in sports, athletes, and the media as well. What caused you to walk away from all the success that you had at ESPN?
What caused me to walk away? Great question to start. I think it was the Lord, if I'm being honest. It was God kind of tugging at my heart. And I don't know. I've told people, when they've said, well, why did you leave? Why would you walk away from working at a place like that? And, a lot has happened in 7 years, with ESPN and change of ownerships and layoffs. I mean, I think there's been 5 rounds of layoffs since I left. I was not laid off. I very well could have been after I
Mm,
left,
yeah.
but I had no idea about any of that. All I knew was that I felt like God was calling me to do more for him. And I still don't know if I can fully explain what that meant because a lot of people could stay in a place like ESPN
Right.
and still do more for the Lord, right? And so for me, I think it was just kind of being open to wherever he wanted to take me and wherever he wanted me to go. I kind of felt like deep down that my time was up or coming up
Mm,
that last year, but I didn't know. I mean, I just kind of trusted God and what I did do, I will say is I've discovered that, this is what it's called now. I didn't really know it at the time, but I was trying to be actively patient
mm,
in the waiting of what the Lord was doing because I really wanted to kind of get out of there in 2015. I thought that's the time to leave ESPN. It was probably the hardest time for me. And it wasn't until February of 2017 until I left. So it was about a year and a half of waiting, being patient, seeking God, seeking other leaders, other advisors, other mentors, and just kind of talking to them. Not necessarily looking for a job or looking for the
mm.
next opportunity, but really just talking to them, learning about their journeys, and asking them to pray for me as I try to figure out what's next.
Yeah. So you're there. Now you help lead, run, start Sports Spectrum. So can we talk about what Sports Spectrum is? Did you have any idea that was your next step after ESPN, and how did this all come about?
Yeah, so I first got introduced to Sports Spectrum in 2013. I was in New Orleans covering the Super Bowl with ESPN, and they reached out. A couple of the people who were the editors and writers reached out, saw that I had been, I guess, open about my faith on
Mm,
social media, love sports, obviously, and they wanted to just kind of have dinner. And I said, yeah, let's go. I was kind of by myself, even though we had our team down at the Super Bowl. And so we had dinner one night, and I met a guy named Stephen Copeland, who ended up being my
mm,
co-author for both of my books, but also a great friend. But at the time, I really didn't know who he was or the other two guys, but I had heard about Sports Spectrum. Now that I've worked there for 7 years, obviously the history of Sports Spectrum goes back to 1985. So
okay.
in 2025, it'll be 40 years that Sports Spectrum's actually
Wow.
been around, which is kind of cool. But, I really didn't have any inkling. I mean, I wasn't a Christian until 2001, 2002.
Mm,
So even that alone would have, prompted me to have any interest in knowing about a sports spectrum in the 90s. But I have had a lot of people tell me that they got the magazine when they were kids. They used to listen to the Sports Spectrum radio show in the
okay.
1990s, which was in the Midwest and heard by a lot of people and hosted by a guy named Chuck Swirsky, who is now the voice of the Chicago Bulls. So Sports Spectrum's been around for a long time, but it wasn't until 2016 when this is I don't know, 6 months before I left ESPN,
Mm,
when I had been in contact with a guy named Steve Stenstrom, who is my current boss. He's the president of Sports Spectrum and the president of a ministry called Pro Athletes Outreach. And Steve and I had had conversations, not really necessarily for open jobs and positions, but there was talk about, hey, wouldn't it be cool to kind of do ministry someday together? And he and another guy called me in the late summer of 2016 and said, hey, do you
mm.
know about Sports Spectrum? And I said, I've heard of it. And I had dinner with a couple of the guys that work there. Why? And they said, well, we just acquired Sports Spectrum
Oh,
as
wow.
part of our ministry with Pro Athletes Outreach. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And they said, well, I don't know if you're still feeling like God's tugging at your heart, but
Mm,
maybe this could be an opportunity for us to work together. And over the next 3 months, we had some conversations. And, when they made the actual offer to bring me on, it was 40% less than what I was
mm.
making at ESPN. It was a contract position. There were no benefits. And right, it was just, do you want to do this? And
Yeah.
most people, I think, would have balked and just walked away and just said, I can't do this at this stage of life. I was
Mhm.
42 at the time. My daughter was in middle school, getting ready to go to high school and soon college, which is where she is now. And so at the time, it really didn't make sense. But I think that's why I really wanted to pursue it, because that's where I think God is calling us to kind of
Mm.
enter into, is the places that are a little scary,
Yeah.
a little uncertain, and in some cases don't make sense, which is what will happen when we can fully put our trust and reliance on Him. And that's what happened with me. And I
Mhm.
prayed a lot, talked to my wife a lot, and ultimately we made the decision to pivot away from ESPN.
All right. Hey, what is your role at Sports Spectrum, and what does your kind of like your day to day, week to week look like?
Yeah, my current title, because people like titles, is
Yeah.
executive producer of Sports
Okay.
Spectrum. Prior to that, I was the director of media. I've also been a channel manager. I mean, there's different titles. I also host or co-host now the
Mhm.
Sports Spectrum podcast, which I can tell you about more
Yeah.
about that co-host role in a minute. But I currently am an executive producer, so I oversee all of the content that comes through all of our ESPN channels. I oversee all production. Anytime we're doing a story, particularly for our magazine, I probably have a hand in that. I'm not the one writing it. I'm not the one executing it or editing it, but those stories kind of funnel through myself and my colleague, John Ackerman, who's our managing editor.
Yeah.
And so I kind of run all that, but I do a lot of kind of, I don't know, getting in the weeds and doing a lot of production with the podcast that I've hosted for 7 years and now co-host and still produce and edit and book.
Mhm.
All of that takes time. And, so I'm on my laptop, getting on Riverside, recording
Right.
interviews, exporting them, editing them, uploading, getting them on YouTube, getting them on Spotify and Apple. So I'm doing a lot of that work that maybe at another place, an executive producer, in air
Right.
quotes here, wouldn't do because they would oversee the people doing that. But for
Mhm.
me, we're a small team, we're a small ministry, a small media company, and so I need to be involved in a lot of ways, in a lot of facets of what we do. So that's kind of the day
Yeah.
to day. A lot of meetings. In fact, yesterday I had 9 meetings, and I came downstairs after, and I looked at my wife, and I said, I didn't do one single ounce of production today. All I did was talk to people. It was
Yeah.
exhausting,
Yeah.
and it was all good and productive things to have conversations about, but I like to just lock in on my computer, give me a set of
Mhm.
headphones, and let's go. Let's edit. Let's create content, and let's just do it. So
Yeah. So you mentioned, the big pay cut. Obviously,
yeah,
one of the big differences between ESPN, which is the largest sports media brand, and going anywhere else, even Sports Spectrum,
yeah.
is like you go from massive budget, you know, all these things, big world
Resources.
class athletes, tons of
Yeah.
money, tons of media personalities, to something that's a lot smaller and doesn't have quite the resources. Was it hard? I'm curious if it, in any way it was hard or frustrating you from having everything you essentially needed at ESPN to do your job to Sports Spectrum, which is like kind of more of an all hands on deck type of approach. What that was a transition like for you?
It wasn't hard initially because I think I was excited. It was kind of treating it like a startup. Like the podcast
Mm,
did not exist until they brought me
yeah,
on and they said, we want you to start the podcast and we want you to host it. And I'd never hosted anything since college. So I was excited about that most. Um, but I was also kind of excited that there wasn't going to be a lot of red tape here. They were
yeah,
really giving me a lot of freedom and trusting me to do the right thing and to know how to handle editorial, know how to handle the guests that we have on, to make sure we're not representing, first of all, representing Jesus in a bad
yeah,
way, but representing the ministry in a bad way. They trusted me and still do to this day in a way that is awesome. And at ESPN, I have people trusting me there too, but like any big organization, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of eyeballs, a lot of people, a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and it's
yeah.
hard to get approval on things
Mm,
to actually be greenlit and go. And we don't have to worry about that. So, in that respect, I love it. But there are other things that I dream about and think about. Somebody told me recently, what would be your cartoon bubble? And I thought that was fascinating to say it like that. And it's like, what's the dream of things that you would like to do with
yeah,
Sports Spectrum that you haven't been able to do? And those are the things I think about all the time, that if we had more resources, more finances, more manpower, we could do some amazing things at a really high quality level, which I think we're doing already, but we could do even more. And I'm
Yeah.
talking about like documentaries and things like that, that I
Mm.
think would be incredible to try and accomplish, but we just can't do those. And sometimes that's frustrating.
Yeah.
It's also frustrating, I think, with a small team sometimes, because even though you have, I'll just say this, our team is amazing, but our team carries a lot. Like we're all
Mm.
juggling tons of balls every single day. And that's a lot. And it can lead to burnout if you're not careful. And we've had some real serious conversations about that with not just myself, but with our entire team, because we're asked to do a lot for a small amount of people. Like our entire ministry is 15 people that are
Mm.
working on it. 15. Sports Spectrum is about 3 full time, and then 3 or 4 others that have footprints or handprints on Sports Spectrum on a part-time basis or a contract basis. That's not a lot of people.
Yeah.
And for if you look at the content that we're cranking out, it's a lot. And
Yeah.
so part of that is our own burden of saying, okay, we can cut back on some of this if we want, but that's not how you grow. And I think
Mm.
really what we want to do is just continue to continue to do the work we're doing, be mindful of the people that are working with us and making sure we're not overtaxing anyone, including myself, but also then dreaming and believing that God's going to provide and make things the way He wants to make them, and maybe blow our minds in some cases in the next
Yeah.
few years what could happen.
Yeah. So I'm curious, speaking of, smaller teams, small budget, especially relative to some of these other media outlets,
Yeah.
but on the podcast magazine, I mean, you guys have some pretty heavy hitters. Like
Hmm.
you interview athletes, college, all shapes and sizes, but like some professional athletes, everyone would know that has listened to this, even if you're just like not a big sports fan. Like you've
Yeah.
interviewed some of the biggest ones. How does someone like Sports Spectrum get some of these athletes? Like, what's the process like for you?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a few things. First of all, I think my experience and my time at ESPN for 10 years as a talent booker and a talent
Yeah.
producer helps with knowing ways of getting athletes and coaches and people like that. So the combination is, first of all, relationships.
Yeah.
I told you our company, Sports Spectrum, is part of a ministry called Pro Athletes Outreach. Well, there is some pro athletes in the Pro Athletes Outreach ministry, obviously, and it's actually a governed ministry that's a pro to pro ministry. So the pro athletes
Mm.
are on the board and are governing this
Wow.
ministry as well as participating in it and being involved in it. So there are a lot of people that are involved with that ministry. That's who I work for, that come on Sports Spectrum, but not everyone. I would say it's like 40 to 50% maybe of the
Mm.
guests, maybe a little less, 30% that are part of that ministry that come on with us, but plenty of people that have never been a part of that ministry, including CJ Stroud from Houston
Yeah.
with the Texans, that is on the cover of our magazine and has not been a part of PAO yet. I hope he will be, but that's a guy who we just reached out to through the Texans. We had a good relationship with Case Keenum, who's his backup
Mm.
quarterback, and has a friendship with him. So Case helped kind of get the ball rolling for us. But then the Texans had to say, okay, is this a place we really want CJ to be on? And I'm grateful that they actually asked CJ, because he's a devout follower of Jesus.
Mm.
And I think when he saw what we wanted to do, he was all in on it. And that's how we
Yeah.
got CJ. So I
Yeah.
think it's just relationships. A lot of it is kind of falls in your lap, if you want to call it that, or people might call it luck. I call it, divine intervention, but
Yep.
it's different conversations with different people that lead to different opportunities. I will say sometimes we just go to social media and DM people and ask them if they want to come on and tell their Jesus story with us.
Mm.
And that's not like a hook to say, um, let's get them to tell their Jesus story, but let's really ask them deep rooted questions that are
Right.
going to be controversial. That is not who we are. We really do just want to talk about their Jesus story. And if we can talk some football or baseball or basketball in there as well, great. But for the most part, I want to hear about the most important thing in their life that they never
Mm.
get to talk about in the media.
Yeah. That's great. Now I'm curious, probably hard to pick. I'll maybe ask you, maybe you do too. Maybe like, what's been some of your, maybe a favorite interview of a well-known athlete, and then maybe a favorite interview of someone that we might not have be as familiar with?
Yeah, so you're asking me to go back and think about 1,400 interviews over
That's
7
right.
years, which is
No big
hard.
deal.
No big deal. So one interview I'll tell you about, I don't even remember her name, but I'm going to tell you
Mm.
the story because it was like 7 years ago. But the big name people, I think recently getting a chance to talk to Brock Purdy,
Mm.
over the last 3 years from the San Francisco 49ers. We talked to him when he was in college at Iowa State. We talked to him about a year and a half later, when he had just finished his first season with the 49ers at his house, by the way, which was just crazy. And that's a whole nother story
Right.
for maybe another time or maybe today. But getting to talk to Brock then, and then seeing him at the Super Bowl last year and seeing God bring him on the biggest stage and
Yeah.
getting to talk to him about Jesus there, I was so impressed with him because he was the same guy in all three interviews.
Mm.
And it's very easy, and I've been around a lot of guys who, when they're in college, they're one person. They get to the NFL, they're another person. They get a lot of fame, a lot of fortune, which is coming his way soon,
Yeah.
and then they become a completely different person. Well, Brock was the same. He's the same
Yeah.
guy, rooted in Christ, loves his family, loves football, um, confident but humble, and just awesome. Just an awesome guy. And I was so happy to see that over a 3 year period,
Yeah.
that not a lot changed with who he is. I'm sure things have changed around him. The
Right.
people in his life have probably changed in
Yeah.
some ways, but him as a person and the deep rooted faith that he has not changed or wavered at all. So Brock's a guy that I hope I get to talk to again sometime, maybe in the off season this year.
Mm.
We'll ring him up and see if he'd be willing to come back on. Hopefully he
Yeah.
would. But I would say there was this interview that I did. It's early on in the Sports Spectrum
Mm.
podcast, and I hope her name comes to my mind, but it doesn't right now. So forgive me as I look this up in a minute here and try to
Yeah. Go for it.
remember who it was. But this is a young gal who I had met when I was at ESPN, and it's a super, super young gal. She wasn't an athlete or anything like that, but it was one of those moments where what she had experienced was just incredible. Like, to the point where she should have died, the point
Mm.
where she should not have survived, and she did. And of course, I'm telling you this as I'm trying to look her name up
Right.
on my internet here, and I can't find it. So please forgive me.
Yeah.
But she has this in powerful story. Nobody would have known her. Like, she's not famous at
Yeah.
in any way. She wanted to be a reporter in sports. And so her and I met, I think we were in Tampa when I was working on Mike and Mike, and we were at the college football playoff that year. I think it was Clemson and Alabama in the finals. And she just said, "Can I come and meet you for a few minutes and tell you my story?" I said, "Sure." So she meets me in the lobby of the hotel that I'm staying at. And it was probably around breakfast time, a little after Mike and Mike was over. And what she was sharing just blew my mind. And I
Mm.
said, if I ever host this podcast or, go into this place that I think I'm going, I would love to have you on as a guest. And she came on, and I wish I could even tell you the depth of the story. It's just kind of mind blowing. I'll just say that. Like, she got in a car accident, should have died, had somebody who she clearly knew came over and prayed for her. That person who prayed for her she's never been able to find him
Hmm.
again since then. And you can always say, "Oh, this is just made up stuff. This is crazy," but I don't believe it is. God gave her a second chance on life in an incredible way, and it was a story worth telling. And that's
Yeah.
what I love about the show we get to do. Yes, we always have athletes and coaches for the most part on, broadcasters, people you would know or at least on some level know. But every so often, we'll get a guest like that, and I'll hear the story. And sometimes those stories, I probably say we've done maybe 30 of those kind of stories over 7 years. And when those stories come to me, they usually come to me now through emails or somebody
Mm.
saying, "Hey, you need to check out this story from this person." They're my favorites, if I'm being honest, because they're the people that are just kind of grinding through life.
Yeah.
There's no fame and fortune. And I'm not saying the athletes aren't incredible to talk to. They are. They're the reason a lot of people listen.
Yep.
But it's those stories, man, those personal stories of God just doing incredible things in the lives of his people who are just kind of daily grinding it out, trying to live for him, trying to do the right thing. And I love those stories.
Yeah. That's great. I'm maybe kind of a weird question. Speaking of the podcast, you guys have been doing it for about 7 years. Do
Yeah.
you see like a big jump in downloads when you have like a CJ Stroud compared to someone else, or is it pretty consistent kind of over time? How does
Yeah.
it look for you?
We still see a big jump when we have a
Yep.
big name. Like when CJ was on, it's been our most listened to show this year, our most watched show on YouTube. Like CJ for sure. Um, spiked, if you will,
Yeah.
But here's an interesting thing: CJ never shared it.
Yeah.
And if he did, which I really wanted him to do, it just never
Right.
happened. If he did, I think it would have been an even bigger spike, if I'm being
Right.
honest. But he didn't, and that's okay. No harm, no foul. I'm never bitter or mad at people
Yeah.
who don't want to share or maybe just don't think about sharing the show. It's okay. I prefer if they did, and I
Right.
appreciate when they do, and I'm sure you do. And I
Yeah.
promise you, I will share this show on my socials. But
Yeah.
when you get a guy like CJ and his name is pretty high and big and
Right.
well known, people are interested. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
But fair outside of him, it's not that often that happens. I mean, we see our biggest spikes around Super Bowl time. So
Okay.
just in general. So I
Yeah.
could talk to somebody that you probably don't know who's the second string this or the backup that. And that number is much higher than it would be in, let's say, July, August, or September, or even
Yeah.
in February, March, April.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think big names help, but we're not talking to big names all the time. So I
Right.
think the consistency of the audience is kind of there.
Yeah.
I will say something happened about a year and a half ago with the algorithms within Apple. I'm probably getting
Mm.
way too techie here, but I don't know,
It's
maybe
great.
people listening like it.
Yeah.
And the numbers went down. And I thought, oh, I started taking that personally, like, ugh,
Yeah.
I'm a terrible host. I'm a terrible promotions guy, whatever it looks like. People are done listening to our show. And I realized that's not the case. Apparently, Apple had told their story through the analytics in a way that was a little bit fudged, if you
Mm.
will, in terms of how people were listening. So our numbers went down pretty, not significantly, but down. Let's just say
Yeah.
that. And then I started asking other people, and they're like, yep, we're down to it's not your show. It's just the way analytics are being counted
Yeah.
now. And I'm like, okay, good. And so we
Right.
started to think about other creative ways for people to hear our shows and watch our
Yeah.
shows. So we've been posting, full podcasts on Twitter, Twitter
Mm.
X,
Yeah.
about a week after they released, on the actual podcast forums. And we've seen really good results from that too. I mean, the views are counted differently in Twitter X, I think, than they would
Yeah.
be as downloads for podcasts, but we're seeing some pretty high numbers there, and it's starting to. Uh, Back when I first started this podcast, podcasting used to be exclusive to just podcasts, so it could
Yeah.
only be on Apple,
Right.
and there wasn't really video recordings in 2017, nothing like Riverside or Zoom or
Right.
anything like that. And it was just so exclusive. But I think now we've gotten to the point where, I mean, I watch a lot of my podcasts, not my shows, but a lot of the podcasts I listen to on YouTube. When I'm
Yeah.
here working during the day, I'll put it on in the background or whatever. I still listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts when I'm on my walks or when I'm working out. If I'm on Twitter and I'm scrolling for, a half hour or something like that and something pops up, I'll sit and watch there too. So I think we just want to kind of be where everybody is.
Right.
And if they get a piece of the show or a clip or the whole thing, we're just grateful for that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's cool. I'm curious. I mean, you mentioned 1,400, well over 1,000 interviews probably in your time doing all these things.
Yes.
How do you prep for your interviews? Is it like the same canned list of questions? Is it different per guest? How do you get ready for all
I
your
love I
shows?
love questions like this because I don't get asked questions
Yeah.
like this too often because it's behind the scenes, right? But the prep, I learned this from Bob Lee, who is the host at ESPN, who I worked with for many years. And then I
Yeah.
saw this a little bit more with Mike Greenberg, who's also one of the best interviewers. But Bob to
Hmm.
me he was called the general. His name was Bob Lee. You can figure that
Yeah.
out. But the general, he was just the top of the top, right? When things needed some seriousness, some professionalism, Bob
Hmm.
Lee, he's the guy. And I got to work with him. I got to produce for him. I got to book guests for him, but I got to watch him prep for shows. And what he
Yeah.
would do is he would always prep 7, 8 questions that he would ask the guests that he would interview, but he would also listen really, really well. And sometimes he might only ask 1 or 2 of those questions.
Hmm.
So I've taken that with me on a much, much, lower level, we'll just say, as far as the talent goes. And I've been doing this way for 7 years, really, is I will, with every single guest we have, I will spend at least an hour, if not more, the day before, or even a couple days before, and prep for the guest. So I might watch a couple clips of them on other shows. I might just go and read about, simple things like where they were born and when they were born. And because I like to put the date of births on my prep, Dylan,
Mm,
because that gives me a mindset of when they grew up and what was
mm,
happening in the world. And
yeah.
usually, most of the people now, because of where I am in life, are younger than me. So I can kind of gauge where they were in life as they grew up, as they were born, wherever it might be. So I always put some background information, where they were born, date of birth, and then just some highlights, right? Three-time All-Pro, 1,000 yards last year, participated in this, won this award, etc. And then I go to questions, and I'll put in usually 9 or 10 questions. Some of them are very similar than other
Mm,
shows. I want to hear about their Jesus story. So I'll just
yeah.
ask simply, tell me your Jesus story. But they're not all the same questions. A lot of the questions revolve around what I've seen and heard about their story. And so instead of just general questions about what's it like to be an NFL player, I want to ask CJ Stroud, like, okay, you come into the NFL as a number three overall pick or number two overall pick, a lot of expectations, a lot of pressure, and you excel. Like you do really well. What was it like to adjust into the NFL as a guy who was coming right from college at 21 years old, and all
Yeah.
of a sudden everything is thrown at you, not just on the field and playbooks and the professional life, but all of the accolades and all of the eyeballs and all the people wanting a piece of CJ Stroud. And so that caters the question to him. I can't ask that same question if I'm interviewing you, obviously,
Yeah.
unless you played in the NFL and were
Not
second
yet,
overall pick,
Jason.
which I don't think
Not
you
yet.
have,
You,
Dylan.
you you might not know. Yeah.
Maybe someday, maybe
That's
someday.
right.
But that's how I prep. I try to ask sometimes similar questions, but other times I try to figure out something that's different. I also try to put in those 10 questions a question maybe that they've never been asked. And that is
Mm,
a hard one because especially when you talk to these veteran guys who've been asked every sort of question in the book, I try to find something that I can ask that's a little different. And usually that centers around the faith aspect of what I want to talk about and asking them about Christ as opposed to just preparing for a basketball season or a football season.
yeah. Now, you don't have to give the name out, but can you think of like one of the worst interviews you've ever done? Whether on your end, their end, it was just awkward.
Yes. Yeah, there
What
will be
happened?
no name giving on,
Yeah.
on this answer, but I can think of a few right off the top of my head. I'll tell you offline too who it was, but I would never want to put that person, on
Right.
blast on a podcast. But I will say it was a prominent pastor, well known, who, if I said his name, you would all know him. And he's also been a chaplain in the sports world
Mm,
for some teams as well. And when I found out we were going to talk to him, I was really excited. We had 20 minutes. I figured I would do 3 questions because they're pastors. They speak
right.
for a living and they can't stop talking
Right.
sometimes, right? And so I thought this is going to be an easy interview. In 20 minutes, I asked 19 questions.
Oh my goodness.
Every answer was about 20 to 30 seconds. They were
Mm,
great answers,
right.
but they were so short. And I'm
Right.
like, man, just expand on this. Talk a little bit more, share a story, something. And again, to say I'm disappointed or say it was a bad interview, I don't think that's the case. I think I just expected way
Right.
more because
Right.
I'm talking to somebody who's a pastor, who speaks for a
Right.
living, who writes books and is a chaplain. So he's got tons of stories
Right.
and it just didn't click. And again, I'm very empathetic in those moments to think, okay, maybe it was just a bad day. Or maybe he was thinking about whatever else he had to think about. Or maybe there was something going on in his family. You just don't know.
Right.
But for that moment, for me, um, yeah, because I've had many pastors on the show. I'd say 25 to 30 pastors, maybe even more. Maybe it's more like 50 who've been on our show if you count chaplains and people like that. And those are usually the easiest interviews because
Right.
you just tee them up and they talk anyways for a living. And they're great storytellers because that's what they do.
Yeah.
And you just go with it. And that one, unfortunately,
Mm,
didn't happen.
that's awesome. Now, I'm curious. A lot of people probably listen to you, especially if they're sports fans, talking to athletes and sports media. It's like that's a dream. That's a dream
Mhm.
job. I wish I could do something like that. What's hard? Like what is hard about what you do, and what do people get wrong about what it's like to do what you do?
What is hard about what I do? Well, I think what's hard is the behind the scenes things that people don't see, starting with the request for the guest.
Yeah.
I get a lot of no replies on
Mm,
guests, and that's the most frustrating part of my job is not I would say with all aspects of my job, if you don't reply when I'm asking something, even if I'm just replying for, an answer with my team or whatever, that's frustrating.
Yeah.
And I'm just a guy who just wants to over communicate. I can handle no really well. When I was 25, I probably couldn't handle no well,
Mm.
but I can handle no really well now at 51. And so when I request a guest or when I put a request out, if you don't reply, I'm just frustrated and trying to find out, okay, why aren't they replying? Or are they ghosting me? Or are they just not, are they just, terrible at texting back or emailing or whatever? In the beginning, I would just rather them say, no, I can't do that right now. Thanks for reaching
Yeah.
out, though. And I'd be like, no problem. Moving on to the next thing. That's frustrating. I think that's hard. I also think sometimes getting people to agree to come on and then, like we talked about, sharing the podcast, because I think doing an interview with us is probably an easy yes for a lot of people because we're not ESPN in the sense that we're not big.
Yeah.
But I think if we were the size of an ESPN, but knowing that the type of interviews that we're doing were faith driven, I think we probably have a lot more pushback because a
Hmm.
lot of people have some apprehensiveness to themselves about sharing their faith publicly.
Yeah.
And I've seen athletes actually say or talk to me about, if I do this, I can't really share it because it might affect my brand, or my marketing manager doesn't think this is good for me, or I don't want to represent my team and misrepresent the fact that I'm a Christian. I'm like, that saddens me
Yeah.
when I hear that. I respect them when they say that, but it saddens me because that's not what we're called to do as believers. We're called to share our
Hmm.
faith, not to force it or to be jerks about it, but to share our faith and to go and make disciples, right? And so
Yeah.
that's why I love what CJ Stroud's about, because he's so unashamed about his faith in every circle he's in. And guys like Jonathan Isaac and the NBA with the Orlando Magic are the same way. They're just unashamed. They're authentically themselves as followers of Jesus. And but others, in some cases, they maybe have a really deep rooted faith, but they're so famous or popular or whatever that they don't talk about it, and it could affect their brand. And that's the hard part of the job. And I also think I mentioned this earlier. Working with a small team is amazing because it's like kind of living in a small town. Everybody knows
Yeah.
everybody. Everybody knows everybody else's business. But there's also disadvantages or, some negative to that because everybody knows everybody's business. And
Yeah.
so I think with a small team, sometimes, we carry a heavy weight, a burden of the work that we do and juggle a lot of balls, like I mentioned. And sometimes it can be a little bit difficult on a day-to-day basis with stuff we have going on, and trying to keep that fuse not too short, and trying to extend that fuse a little bit and not get too upset over stuff when it doesn't happen. But that's the hard part that a lot of people don't see.
Mhm.
But it's all worth it. I'll
Yeah.
just end it with that because you asked about what the hard part is, but to me,
Yeah.
it's all worth it. One of my good friends and people I work with right now said this the other day, and then I'll shut up. He just said, "All we're trying to do, Jason, is help people get home.
Mhm.
That's all we're trying to do." And I would say, as I talk to you as a pastor, the same thing. That's really all we're all
Yeah.
trying to do. We're not we're not the answer to their home, to how to get home, but we're just showing them how to get home, or providing them ways to get home, whether it's listening to a podcast, whether it's talking to an athlete who's talking about their faith and that's helping them get home, whether it's reading something that's encouraging, a devotional, or whether it's pointing them to churches in Raleigh, North Carolina or other areas
Yeah.
to learn how to get home. For me, I go to Bristol, Connecticut, Hillside Community Church, and that helps me to get home. And so that's really all, if we're in ministry, that we're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I just thought of this. You're a
Yeah,
sports fan. You have your teams, but we
huge.
also have talked with a lot of athletes. Have you ever I don't I think, are you a Mets fan? I feel like for whatever reason. Okay, let's
Yes.
say you're watching the Mets, but they're playing another team, but you've maybe interviewed some of the guys on their team. Do you ever find yourself pulling for your team or pulling for the guys that you know? What
Okay.
happens in that situation?
I love this question. First of all, I'm always diehard my teams first.
Okay.
Um, but it's changed how I've watched sporting events now, or at least uh, processed sporting events now
Mm.
differently. So I'm rooting a lot of times for the story, especially from a faith perspective. A couple years back, I was rooting for the Eagles' story
Mm.
because so many of them, Nick Foles and many others, love the Lord.
Yeah.
So I was rooting for the story, but I'm still a Dallas Cowboys fan, which is
Okay.
not saying a whole lot right now because they're a
Right.
mess. But as a Cowboys fan, I can never root for the Eagles, if that makes sense. But I
Right.
watched that Super Bowl and I was cheering for that story of Nick Foles doing what he did in winning Super Bowl MVP. And what's funny is
Yeah.
I've become friends with Nick now. And I've told him my brother is a diehard Eagles fan. And he's like, oh, but you're not? And I'm like, you don't want to know the team I root for, Nick. And he goes, oh, I know the team you root for just because you said it like that. And it's okay that you're a Cowboys fan. I'll forgive you. And I'm like, great. Okay,
Yeah.
Nick, we're friends. But it's been an interesting journey to watch teams that I normally despised as a kid. Like I'll give you an example. In the World Series, it just happened, right? The Yankees have two guys, Clay Holmes and Luke Weaver, who have been on Sports Spectrum, who work within our Ministry of Pro Athletes Outreach, who I've gotten to know really well, and they love Jesus. So I'm rooting for those guys to have an amazing World Series and for the Yankees to win. When I'm watching that World Series, I'm rooting for them, for the Yankees to win for them, but I can't root for the Yankees. Does that make sense? Because I'm a
Right.
Mets fan, so I can't root for the Yankees. I have to root for the Dodgers. As a sports fan, because I'm a Mets fan, I cannot root for the Yankees.
Yeah.
But I can really root for Luke Weaver and Clay Holmes to have a great series. On the other side, Tommy Edman with the Dodgers has been on our show,
Mhm.
loves Jesus, and in the National League Championship Series, he destroyed the Mets, the team that I root for. And so I'm watching the NLCS with my wife, and I think it was game 6, the last game, and Edmund hits a home run, and she's like, oh, I'm so sorry, honey. This is my wife showing empathy for
Right.
me, knowing I'm sad with the Mets. And I'm like, it's okay. At least it was Tommy that did it. You know, he hit the home
Right.
run, and I like Tommy, and I hope he goes on and wins the World Series and talks more about Jesus, you know, at the podium again and wins the World Series MVP. Like, so he won the NLCS MVP, and I knew that this was an opportunity for him to talk about Christ. So you can see I'm kind of conflicted a little bit, but I will never waver from rooting for my teams.
Okay.
I never will do that, and I'll stick
Nice.
with them no matter what. Those are my teams since I was 7 or 8 years old, and that's going to be how it is, hopefully, until I
Yeah.
die. But I will say, watching sports now is just different for me because if there are guys on the teams that I really don't like that love the Lord, I'm rooting for those guys. I really am, and I want them to do really well, and I want them to have the platforms that they have, so that ultimately they get this chance to point people back to Jesus.
Yeah. That's great. Now you hit on this a little bit, but I'm curious about, sports spectrum, growing sports spectrum. Obviously, super sports media is super competitive, especially now that anyone can do
Yes,
a show, podcast, YouTube. Like it's
totally.
just hard, and everyone's got opinions. What's it been like for you to kind of grow sports spectrum? I know you talked about Twitter X as kind of one strategy.
Yeah.
What is it like for you? What are your goals? How do you do that in such a crowded landscape?
It was so hard, I would say initially, but thankfully it's been since 2017, and it was less crowded in 2017 than it is in
Yeah.
2024. But it was crowded then too. I will say this: Sports Spectrum, as far as I know, is the only. I would say we're also the largest, but it's the only sports media company that highlights the Christian faith within the athletes,
Mm.
especially on a daily basis. You can go to Instagram and you can find some Instagram pages that do a great job on curating content from other people and posting about athletes that talk about Jesus. And they
Yeah.
can grow a platform to 100,000 followers or more. And that's what we're at too. But the day-to-day content creation as a media company, the interviews that we do, like I said, over 1,000, right? Like the big announcement that we've had, we just brought Matt Forte on as a co-host on Sports Spectrum, and that is to try and cut through a little bit more
Mm.
with that noise that's out there in the media space. But bringing Matt on, all these things, like we are doing this every day. We are in it and doing it every day. And I think we're the only ones that are
Yeah.
doing it every day. And so I think that's what kind of can break through and cut through a little bit more is it's something different. It's not Barstool, it's not ESPN, it's not Fox, it's not Bleacher. And I know that we don't have the audience that they have, and that's fine,
Yeah.
but we're different. And we're going to give you stories of purpose, stories of faith, and stories of hope, and do it in a way un that we're unashamed about Christ, and we're not going to apologize for that.
Hmm.
And I think it's really been fun to kind of explore that for 7 years. And I would say we haven't had that hockey stick moment where we
Right.
just go all the way up and we get this audience that's in the billions or millions or whatever. And that may never happen. It might. I still dream and think it can. Um, but I'm just really grateful where we are. And I think the way we cut through is we just try to provide the conversations that aren't really happening anywhere else. And if it happens to be with a guy like CJ Stroud, or a guy like Tommy Edman, who I just mentioned from the Dodgers, like we'll do that. And hopefully it's unique and different, but also remembering that not everybody's a Christian. And so,
Yep.
and
Right.
we both know that we don't live in an actual Christian nation anymore. We're kind of post Christian a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's going to offend people, and we get notes and comments and things
Mhm.
all the time from people saying, "Would you keep that Jesus out of their mouth? Why are you posting this God crap or whatever?"
Yeah.
And I just consistently come back to John 16. Jesus saying, "In this world you're going to have trouble.
Yeah.
He has overcome the world." So we're going to stay firm in what we believe and continue to put the content out. And if God wants to use it in a way that does cut through the noise or cut through uh, and stand out in a media space, great. And if he doesn't, and he just wants us to be faithful with what we've been doing every day, that's awesome too.
Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, there's a lot of people in sports media, but there's a uniqueness to what Sports Spectrum is doing, kind of the angle talking about
Yeah.
faith. I think it's really cool.
And that's what
Um,
we
uh,
try to do is stand out a
yeah,
little bit differently than just your typical media company.
yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit. Sports Spectrum, awesome. Recommend everyone check that out. You've also written two books, The
Yep.
Uniform of Leadership and then Live to Forgive. Specifically, Live to Forgive, which was your second book. You share the journey of your relationship with your dad. And I know it's a lot you could explain, that sort of thing. But I'm just curious if you'd mind sharing a little bit of what it was like for you to grow up and how you've had to learn to forgive.
Yeah. I will correct you on one thing. It was my first book. So,
Bookstore. Okay.
and then The Uniform of Leadership was my second book.
Okay.
But growing up, yeah, if you had known me when I was 10 or 11 or 12, you would say, okay, yeah, this guy's destined to work in sports because that's all I
Mhm.
cared about. But I also, it's kind of like what was normal to me should not have been normal in terms of not having a dad around or
Right.
having a dad who was an alcoholic. And unfortunately, it's way more common than I ever thought. And having written this book, you meet so many people who
Yeah.
are like, "Yep, my dad was like your dad." So I grew up with a dad who was just he tried, he really did, but he became addicted to alcohol, and it was just it was a tough time for us, especially as we got older and started understanding a little bit more of what was going on with my father. My parents divorced when I was very young, 5 years old. So I really never remember having mom and dad
Mhm.
together in the house. So it was always a split household. And as I got older, though, as my dad would let us down, if you will, with the times that he would get really drunk or have moments where he would verbally abuse us in ways that I just could never imagine doing to my own daughter.
Yeah.
Um, that kind of got hard. And as we got older into our 20s, we started to just, I mean, it's a miracle, praise God, that all three of us, my two brothers and I, have turned out the way we have, given the fact that we grew up the way we did
Yeah.
with our dad. But we've all had our struggles. But God, by His amazing grace, has saved us. And I think forgiveness was something that I really struggled with without knowing that I struggled with it. And
Mhm.
I think that's a lot of cases for a lot of people is they might say, yeah, forgive and forget, or yep, I've forgiven them. I've invited that person back into my life, so I've forgiven them.
Yeah.
But forgiveness is about the bitterness and anger and hatred I think that a lot of us struggle with and kind of seep it down into our souls. And for me with my dad, I loved my dad and I still do love my father, but there were moments when he would anger me when he would drink or get drunk and he would call and he would say the things that he would say that I would lash back out at him. I would
Mhm.
scream and yell. I would, you know, want him to feel the pain that I was feeling. So I would just inflict that back to him and say things that I regret saying to my dad. And that's where the bitterness comes from. And it's really bad. And Paul talks about this in Ephesians about letting all bitterness and anger
Mhm.
and wrath be put away from you. And I didn't understand that. Even after I became a follower of Jesus when I was 27, I understood forgiveness with God the Father and why we had to repent and why we had to invite Christ into our life and the sin that lived within us and salvation and the cross, all of the things that we both know about now. I didn't really know then when I was saying yes to Christ, but I learned about them. But where I could ask for forgiveness from God for my own sins every day, I had a really hard time then, forgiving others who trespassed against us, as the Lord's
Yeah.
Prayer says, especially my father. I'm not a guy who holds a lot of grudges with most people, but I held a grudge with my dad for many, many years, and it wasn't fun. But it was something I felt like I needed to do. I think the reason I was doing that was because I didn't think my dad deserved to be forgiven. Because how
Yep.
could you choose to inflict the pain that you have inflicted on your family? So no, I'm not. You don't deserve forgiveness. And then my dad hit a pretty low point in 2013 and tried to end his own life, and thankfully he did not succeed. But it forced me into some soul searching, some conversations with my pastor, and really scripture to see what the Lord truly said about forgiveness. And Jesus doesn't mess around when you look at the Bible and when
Yeah.
he's talking about forgiveness. I mean, he makes it abundantly clear in Matthew 6 and Matthew 18 and all other places that if you do not forgive your brother when they wrong you, your heavenly Father will not forgive you. And I'm not a biblical scholar, so I don't know if that's a full-on interpretation and all the hermeneutics that are involved in reading that scripture, but that's pretty alarming when you read
Yeah.
clearly what he's trying to say. And I
Yeah.
know now, having studied the topic of forgiveness the way I have, that Jesus is all he's trying to do is allow us to live in the freedom of following him and the freedom in a relationship with the Father. And anything that can kind of hinder in that, he's trying to warn us, like, get that out of there.
Mhm.
And that's what forgiveness was for me. And when my dad hit his lowest point, I think I came to a point where I just said, Dad, I forgive you. And I'm sorry for what you've been going through. And um, yeah, and I just had to verbally tell him that. But I know some people can't tell people. Maybe that person's not with us any longer. But
Yeah.
it's another reminder, Dylan, that forgiveness is not about what anybody else has ever done to you. It's truly about what's inside your own heart. And the freedom that comes in forgiving is not to release the other person from the wrong that they've done. Him and that person and God have to figure that out. It's allowing us to live in freedom and be able to be released from the pain, the bondage that we're stuck in when we hold on to that bitterness. And I've seen that. I saw that the first couple years, started to tell a few people about it, even preached a message, and that's where what led to tell the story in the book form was just seeing how free forgiving is. And
Yeah.
it's not letting the other person off the hook when we forgive. It's just allowing us to live in a place of freedom in our relationship with God. And it's a process. It's not microwavable. It's a daily process that I continue to battle, if you want to say, with every single day, even as we speak right now, and some of the struggles my dad is currently having. But I've forgiven him, and I don't have any bitterness or hatred
Yeah.
towards him anymore. And that's all because of who God is and what he's done for me in my life.
Yeah. That's great. And again, the book goes into a lot more detail, so I highly recommend it, especially if someone's struggling with that,
Yeah.
kind of their own life, maybe some difficulty they met with a father or a friend. There's so many more questions I could ask. We'll end
Yeah.
with this one, and then we'll
We'll do
talk
it
about
again.
ways
We can
people
do
can
it again.
connect. Yeah.
Sure.
I think some of the things I'd ask. I would ask this, especially for those of us that are big sports fans. What is it like to be on Super Bowl row? So can you explain what that is for those that don't know, and then what
Yeah.
it's like?
So Super Bowl Row is about 200 different media outlets that come into a giant, large convention center ballroom that's set up as what they call Super Bowl Media Row. And it's literally probably 8 rows of, I don't know, 25 to 30 media representatives. It's called Media Row now. Back in the day, it used to be
Okay.
called Radio Row because it was all radio stations. But now it's, the way it's evolving, it's not just radio, it's
Right.
podcasting and media entities and all these different things. Sports Spectrum is on Media Row. And yeah, we get 2 tables, a chair, we bring our signage, we sit down, and just somehow, and I know how, but somehow hundreds upon hundreds of different people to interview come through the media center and the media row for 4 to 5 days every week before the Super Bowl and just become available to do interviews with. And, we don't always get everybody that we would like to get because the schedules are the schedules and the priorities are the bigger name shows and the
Right.
shows that are well known. But, we get to talk to a lot of people. We get to see a lot of people. I wish I could write a book on just the sights and sounds of what I see every year at Super Bowl Media Row. Some of those, unfortunately, can never be published,
Right.
and put out to the public to read. But it is fascinating to see. And some of the biggest names, you'll just walk by and you're like, oh, look, there's Emmett Smith, and there's Dan Marino over there.
Yeah.
And oh, there's Brady walking. Oh, yeah, there's Patrick Mahomes with his entourage. Yep, there's Rob Gronkowski right there. There's Gronk walking. It never ends. And it's
Yeah.
fascinating to watch. And it's very easy, if you're not careful, to get caught up in this sort of starstruck, star-studded moments of seeing these very famous people. And yeah, you hope you get a little slice of the pie when you're
Yeah.
there. And that's why we like to be there, is not just for the awareness of Sports Spectrum to be on such a big stage like that, but also because you just never know who you can run into or who you get a chance to talk to. And sometimes you can plan and plan and plan, and those plans go out the window, and you get a chance to sit down and talk to somebody, and you're just like, okay, that was awesome. I'm
Yeah,
so
because
glad.
I was just curious, do you pre-plan these interviews, or it's like you just try to grab people as they're coming by and
It's a
you just go for
combination
it?
of both. So I think beforehand we go in, there's usually 5 or 6 interviews on Radio Row or Media Row that we have scheduled. And, what's funny is even those scheduled interviews usually move around a lot because it's just a constant moving, changing landscape of time and availability for these people. But then it's another 5, 6, maybe it's 8, 10, 12, whatever it might be, people who I just, like last year, we were at the Super Bowl and Devin McCourty walked by, and Devin's been on our show and he saw Sports Spectrum and he saw me. He's like, Jay, what's going on? I'm like, what's up, Devin? I gave him a handshake and a big hug. And then I said to him, hey, you around? Can you do a few minutes with us? And he's like, I got 10 minutes. Let's do it. He sits down. We tape the interview. He's done. He walks away. And there you go. And it's Devin McCourty, 3-time Super Bowl champion with the
Yeah.
Patriots. And it was so much fun to catch up with him. That was not planned. That was just,
Right.
I happened to see him and he happened to come over and he sat down and talked to us. And that is so much about what our conversations have been, is about these relationships that we get to make with people. And hopefully in moments like that, they trust us and know that we are who we are. And they want to come on and have a conversation. So,
Yeah. Well, speaking of conversations, Jason, this one has been awesome. Thanks again for
yeah,
the time.
thank
If
you.
you want to connect with both you and Sports Spectrum, where can they go? The magazine, the podcast, where are the good places?
Yeah, I recommend just going to our website to start, sportspectrum.com, especially with this announcement and this big news of Matt Forte joining our team. You're going to be hearing a lot from him. I mean, this is a guy who played 10 years in the NFL, 2-time Pro Bowler, second all-time leading rusher in Chicago Bears history behind Walter Payton, kind of a big deal. And he loves Jesus, and he's really good at facilitating conversation. So I would say go to sportspectrum.com. You can listen to our podcasts everywhere podcasts are found, but right there on the website, you can get our magazine. You can sign up for our free newsletter. You can read daily devotionals and articles each day for free on the website. So start there. I would say our social media pages as well, where we're sharing some really fun and unique content that other people can then share as well. On our Instagram page, which is growing at a very fast rate, which is really fun to see. We even have TikTok, Dylan, but I'm not there. That's just not my jam.
Come on,
But
let's see a few dances, Jason. Let's do
Sports
it.
Spectrum, there'll be no dances, but Sports Spectrum has a TikTok page, but we're also on Facebook
Right.
and Twitter X and all that. And then I would say, for me, if you want to just contact me, just hit me up on my social pages. I'm mostly sharing about Sports Spectrum or sharing something about my faith. You won't hear me share too much about sports, if I'm being honest. I don't try to put the fandom out there on social media anymore because I respect I will do things like Let's Go Mets if they make it all the way to the NLCS, but
Right.
I respect the guys who are playing against the teams I root for too much to try and just rub it in a moment when, on social media when,
Yeah.
people are hurting and they put so much into their craft. But they can reach out to me on social and would love to hear from them.
Awesome. And we'll link to all those in the show notes as well so people can find that. Jason,
Sounds
thanks
great.
so much for taking the time. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, Dylan, this was great. Thanks for having me, and let's do it again soon.